Today is my mother's 90th birthday. None of y'all care, but because of that, I always remember somebody else's birthday that is today. And at Mark Yoder, happy birthday from all of us. We could sing, but we won't. But we do have a chocolate chip cookie for you. Reminder to everybody that next Sunday is Valentine's Day, so don't forget
that. Of Christ. So before we get there, I was talking with Ben earlier, and if y'all have gotten to know Ben at all, Ben's a jokester, and so we have a little joke that came from Ben, but since I'm teaching, I'll get it. So in order to know where you're going to go in your Bible today, here's a quick joke for you. How does Moses prepare his coffee? He brews it. So if you got a Bible, we're going to be in the book of Hebrews today. You can go ahead and turn there. We'll be in Hebrews chapter 2. That's courtesy of Ben Gardner. Y'all can thank him after for that incredible joke. All right, Hebrews chapter 2, and we're gonna dive in. Today we're gonna look at compassion. And we're gonna look at this in a couple ways, but before we really dive into the compassion side, we're gonna explain a little bit of what compassion is, and we're gonna look at it through a different lens. There's a lady who her name's Brene Brown, and Brene Brown is kind of a traveling speaker. She does a host of TED Talks and other different things, and she has this incredible video that she does where she explains what the word empathy is. And she says that in life, like in the way that we live, we kind of walk through life with two understandings of how we deal with people that have walked through situations that are difficult. We're either sympathetic or we're empathetic. We're one of the two. And she explains it this way, is if you imagine that I happen to fall into a hole in the middle of the ground right here, there are a couple of things that happen by me falling in this hole. You can respond in really one of two ways. You can respond by looking into that hole and saying, I'm sorry you're down there. Can I get you anything? And then you can kind of keep on cruising. And that's what we would describe as sympathy. It's feeling bad for somebody without there being any kind of further things that we do, any kind of further maybe response on our side. But then she goes on to say that there's a deeper connection that we have with people in these moments. And this is really where we're going to hone in because we see this characteristic in Jesus all the time. It's the empathy side. And the empathy side, it says this, is that if I walk by a hole and I look down and I see somebody in it, that I stop and I jump into the hole with them. And however long it takes them to get out and whatever it looks like during that duration, it's me being willing to say, hey, I understand where you're at. Maybe I've even been there before, and I'm with you until the end. And this trait of empathy is really the definition of what we're going to look at with compassion. Brene Brown, she says this in her talk. She says this, rarely can a response make something better. What makes things better is connection. And this is true for all of us, right? It's rarely just a little act of looking and saying, hey, it's rather though like when we find ourselves in situations where we need help or we need people, what makes those situations really unique and really impactful is when we're able to have a connection, when community or when a relationship is formed. If you've read any of the book of Job, you know the story of Job. It begins where Job is living this life and he's been given all of these different things. And over the course of his life, the enemy, the devil comes to God and is like, hey, I can make him trip up. And so through a host of temptations and a host of different trials that are then set on his life, Job loses everything. Right? Family is killed. He loses his land. He loses his business. He loses his income. And he's basically left with nothing. And at the end of the second chapter, it says that Job goes out and he begins to mourn his life. And these three friends come alongside and they sit with him. And here's what I love that it says is that for one whole week, they don't say a word to Job. They just sit there with him. They are empathetic in this moment. Now later we see them, you know, they offer some bad advice and different things, but I love this idea because I think this is the essence of what empathy is. Empathy is this willingness to say, hey man, I know that you just walked through maybe one of the most traumatic things that you've ever experienced. But empathy says, hey, I'm with you, whatever that looks like. Even if it's just my physical presence in your life, I'm with you. And so this trait of empathy is something that we see oftentimes in the life of Christ. And so we're going to define, a lot of people would define compassion this way. This is the Webster's definition of compassion. It's this, it's sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or misfortunes of others. So that's how Webster would define it. I want to change it to where it says this, is that compassion, as we understand from Jesus and as we understand what the calling is on our life, compassion is empathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or misfortunes of others. Empathetic, it's this willingness to say, hey, I feel for you, I have concerns, I have things that I understand that you're walking through, and more than just seeing those and walking on and feeling something, my compassion is gonna be an extension of the willingness to sit and to form relationship and to be in that whole with you while you're there. All right, so today we're gonna be in Hebrews chapter 2. If you've got your Bible and you're already there, you can go ahead and flip Hebrews 2. We're gonna read 5 verses together, and then we're just gonna kind of plow through what the author of Hebrews is talking about in these verses. All right, so Hebrews chapter 2, we will begin looking at verse 14. It says this, since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. For surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are currently being tempted. So verses 14 and 15, they say this, and I think there's a couple of things, interesting words that are highlighted in these 2 verses the author of Hebrews brings up. One is that he likewise partook, which is this idea that he has now similarity with us because of who we are. So when we think about Jesus, one of the attributes he has is an extension of his compassion, being an empathetic God. It's that because of his empathy, he looked at us and he said, I will also partake of the things that they are partaking of. And for him, that meant stepping out of heaven and entering into fractured humanity, right? He put on, in a sense, he put on fractured flesh so that he could endure what we endure in our human existence. All right, so he partakes of these things in order for him to be able to deliver us. And so part of the way that it was set up with God, and one of the things we see with Jesus is that he similarly to us partakes in what we live through, what we go through every day in order to then deliver us from the things that plague us every day. Right? So it's this is the way that God set it up. He will likewise partake in order to deliver us. Like our path to God meant that Jesus had to come, and in his compassion, he puts on this empathetic spirit and now walks in life with him. One of the ways maybe we would say it this way is that compassion led Jesus to take on fractured flesh and endure humanity with us, right? Now we need to understand it this way, like Jesus is walking in flesh, it was in endurance, right? This was something that was uncomfortable. It was him coming out of the place that he currently existed, where he was existing with God in heaven. You know, Colossians has this great kind of, if you were with us here at CCC several months ago, I don't know how long ago did we do Colossians? I don't remember, but it was a while ago. We did this kind of stair step analogy of the downward kind of the downward humility of Jesus, where it basically talks about how he was with God, he was in heaven, and he came out of heaven and he put on human flesh, and he continued to be humble all the way to the point of death. And then God at that point he kind of stair steps up to this point where he receives glory. But this experiencing humanity, this is kind of it's a downward mobilization that Jesus wears and that he does. But he did that so that he could then endure humanity alongside of us, right? And I think one of the hardest things in life a lot of times is what do we do in situations where we walk into life with people that are struggling, right? That are walking through heartache. And it's interesting because like sometimes we don't really know the words to say. Brene Brown in this video, she talks about the difference and says that one of the things we just lose sight of what to say to people. So people walk through a struggle, they experience loss, or they're having issues in a marriage, or having issues with their kids. And we say things like, well, at least and then we follow that, right? And that's not a connection. That's not connection talk, right? That's sympathetic talk. Well, hey, at least you get this despite all these things. And what she says is, and I think this is really great, empathetic talk is more talk where we say, hey, I'm so glad you told me that. Thanks for being willing to share that. Like, how can I be here for you? Right? It's the willingness to kind of dive in the pit. And we see this all throughout the story of Jesus. Jesus is a pit diver. He walks past men and women every day who are struggling. He walks past he walks and he sees the woman in the well who has found herself in a pit, in a cultural pit where no one looks at her and everybody disowns her and everybody despises her. And he looks at her and he says, hey, I'm with you. And in fact, not only do I want to sit with you, but I want to offer you something to help you come out of the pit that you currently find yourself in. Jesus is the embodiment of empathy. And because of that, he's the embodiment of compassion. Because he does this. He takes on a fractured flesh. He was willing to put it on our behalf and endure the things that we endure so that now we have relation with him. Like we walk through something that's hard and we're like, hey, Jesus did that. We walk through temptation. We're like, Jesus has been tempted. He went into the wilderness and was tempted. I'm experiencing loss. Hey, Jesus dealt with that, right? He wept over the loss of his best friend. He understands. He understands the pain that comes through this life because he has endured fractured humanity with us. And I think when I think about this, I'm like, man, that should drive us even more, right, to him. It makes him so much more relatable. Like we hail Jesus a lot of times as this distant, off a figure who's way out there in left field and he's so far away and we don't know. And I think what these attributes have done for me, at least over the last several weeks, and they continue to do, is they remind us that, listen, Jesus is relatable and he's drawing us in. He's inviting us in to himself if we're willing to understand what it is that he's actually done for us. All right. Hebrews continues in verse 16. It says this, for surely it is not the angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. It's this really great reminder for us that we are, if you remember back in Genesis, we are set as heirs of Abraham. Abraham was given this challenge, hey, you will be a blessing and you will look up into the stars and you will count all the stars and that will be all the descendants that you will have. And it's this, like in Genesis 12, this kind of this play out of the future life of Abraham and how all of the nation of Israel would fall under and be heirs of his. And what this does right here, the author of Hebrews reminds us, hey, listen, we as children of Abraham, as heirs of Abraham, it's the reminder that God is like not forgotten us, right? That the promise that he made with Abraham then is continuing even now. Like we are called in this moment, the offspring of Abraham, and that he comes to help. And this word helps is this idea that he takes hold of us, right? It's this arms wrapping around, guiding of his children, guiding of the people that are around. And so a lot of us, maybe we have this false understanding, I love this idea because when I read things like taking hold or helping, it's the way that I looked at my dad, even now as a grown up, but especially when I was a kid, it's the way that I would look at my dad in moments when I didn't know what to do. And so I would say things, I go to my dad or maybe, you as a father, if you're in the room and you're a dad, you know what these moments are like. It's when your children come to you and they say things like, hey, Dad, I don't really know what to do here. Like, how should I go? And you as a dad, you're able to offer and guide with wisdom into a certain thing. Right? I've got 2 little girls, and one of the things that my oldest, our 3.5-year-old Marin, will do is she'll come up and she'll say, hey, Dad, I'm scared. Can you walk me back to a room, right? At nighttime when she's afraid of something or the dark. She'll say, hey, can you walk me back to my room? And so what do I do as her dad is I come over and I take hold of her hand and I begin this journey back to her room, guiding her every step of the way. This word help is very much what this is. It's Jesus looking and saying, hey, I've made that path 1,000,000 times. I know what's back there. I know it's dark, but I also know where it ends. I know the journey that's in front of you. And even though you find it scary, my helping is I'm gonna take your hand and I'm gonna help guide you on this trek back to where you're trying to go if you'll just let me lead. It's this way, again, which we lean on Jesus as the one who's been there, as the empathetic father we have who has experienced all these things, and we lean into Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, I need your help guiding me back to this place. And this is exactly who Jesus is and what Jesus does, all right? He does not superintend their journey. It's not that he takes over and he says, all right, you stay here and I'll go do the whole thing for you. No, that's not what he does. He doesn't superintend it. He comes and he says, hey, let me guide you by hand. Let me walk with you through this. Let me show you the way so that now you'll understand and you'll be able to experience me in a new way. And our life is kind of, it's run with, we have all of these moments, maybe even daily, where we're walking through life and we experience something, we're like, this is unknown territory. I don't know how to walk through this. And what do we typically do in those moments? We think into our mind, hey, who is somebody in my life that has already experienced this? So Rebecca and I, when we had moved to Sumter, we had just found out, but a couple months before, we had found out she had gotten pregnant, and we found out about a couple of months after that she had lost the baby. All right, that she had had a miscarriage, and this was several months before we moved back to Sumter. And it was one of the hardest things in the world to walk through. And in that moment, it's like we don't know where to go. We don't know what to do. I mean, we're excited about having children, and we were, we didn't have kids yet, and so we're lost, and a little bit even in our understanding, like God, where do we go? We don't know. And it was amazing the outpouring of people that had experienced that came and said, hey, listen, we've been there, and like we just want to walk with you through this journey, whatever that looks like. You know what that is? That is a representation of Jesus by being compassionate and empathetic. It is the willingness to say, hey, I've been down that road, and I will embody the characteristics of Christ to walk you and walk with you through this, as God walks with us through this journey. All right, this is the idea of him holding on to us, which we read in verse 16, is that he helps us. He holds on to those of us who have been made in his image, those of us who are the offspring of Abraham. All right, author continues in Hebrews chapter 2 and says this, therefore, being Jesus, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a mindful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for his sins. Now, there's kind of a lot here, so let me briefly walk through a couple of things that's being said. First of all, later on in the book of Hebrews, the author of Hebrews discusses a little bit of what it meant to be a priest, like what priestly life looked like, and some of the things that happened. And one of the things that the priests were known for is that they had a responsibility to know the people and to live for the betterment of those that they represented. So you elect, like we would elect an elected official here, we elect elected officials, and we expect that elected officials, they look out for our well-being because they know us and they know the city we're in and they know the places and they do a great job of this. In the same way, a priest was hired or was appointed by people and bodies, and their job was then to look out for the best interest of those that they knew and those that they understood and those that lived within that context. All right, so when it tells us here that he had to be made like his brothers, the reason why he's able to become a merciful and faithful high priest because he's been made like his brothers. So what is it that makes God such a great high priest? Is that he has now embodied flesh, walked amongst us, dwelt amongst us, and experienced all of these different things. It gives him a heart of compassion, but it makes him faithful and merciful because now, as a priest who's looking out for our best interests, when we come to God and we say, hey, Jesus, do you really have our best interests in mind? Like, do you actually know what this is like? We can say, yeah, he does. He's looking out for our best interests because he's been there and he understands and he knows what that's like. So one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible comes 2 chapters after this one. It's in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. And here's what it says. It says this, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize, right? It's not what we have. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So what this tells us is, look, we have a high priest, as we've just read in Hebrews 2. His name is Jesus. He's walked through everything we have, and yet he did it without sinning. So when we're looking for what is the gold standard to follow in our life that allows us to follow somebody that's gonna lead us down the right path, it's always Jesus. He's been there. He's compassionate to us because he understands. He's put on flesh, so therefore he's empathetic. He knows all these things and he's lived through all these things because of the embodiment of the flesh that he was given and that he decided to put on. And so for us, one of the things that we're reminded of here is this. Now, Hebrews chapter 2, again, chapter 2 talks about this word propitiation. And propitiation is this really big theological word. So let me just briefly kind of explain what this is. If you're with us over the last couple of weeks, we've walked through on Sunday morning a lot of large theological words about what happened at the cross of Christ. What is it that happened when Jesus was killed on the cross? What happened when he was resurrected? One of the things one of the words that we use for that is propitiation, which is basically is to make an atonement for. So what Jesus does, all right, so Jesus comes and he makes an atonement. And what he does for us in this is that he embodies and takes on all of the sin that we have committed. And so at the cross, all of those things are nailed. So when we think about, hey, there's got to be something to appease the will of God, there's got to be something that appeases God. One of the things that happens in that is that an offering then has to be made. Something to atone for all the sins in our life has to then be made on our behalf. And so this is another like theological understanding of Jesus, is that this is what God does for us, is that he is the atonement. He is an atoning sacrifice, took on all those things, nailed to the cross, blood was shed for us. All right, now, again, an understanding of these things, it changes our vision and the approachability of Jesus. And so what happens is for us in our life is we come into maybe even a place like this and we have hearts that are not the purest. We come in with impure heart, impure notions, impure thoughts in our head. And one of the things that we understand is, look, an impure heart is a heart that's in rebellion against God. And so maybe some of us today, we've walked in and you're like, man, I'm kind of struggling with this, right? Like, I get what you're saying. Jesus has done this. I find him relatable. I see it. I get it. But like, I just have impurities in my heart. And what we understand is like impurities, this is a disobedient heart. And so maybe for some of us, like the first step has to be is that we understand this action that has been taken by God. And then the first stance today is as we leave these doors this Monday afternoon and we walk out of here, it's that, hey, I'm gonna live more in obedience than in disobedience because I understand what was done on my behalf. That I was in the wrong standing. Maybe I'm currently in wrong standing. And so my acceptance of Jesus, my willingness to understand the compassion of Christ that was exemplified for me, understand the empathy of Christ that welcomes me, that jumps in the hole with me when I'm struggling. When I understand all of those things, then I'm led to a decision to say, hey, that's a guy that I want to follow. Like that's a Jesus that I want to hitch my trailer to and say, I am with you to the end. That's a guy that I'm willing to bow my knees to and say, hey, I will deal with all the struggles of this life and all that comes with it. Struggles in marriage, struggles being a dad, struggles in business, struggles being an employee, all the things that come with it. I will hitch my trailer to Jesus and I will say, hey God, I'm with you to the end. And I will sit with you in that. And so we move from hearts of disobedience into hearts that are willing to be transformed by an understanding of what God has done for us. And then he closes in verse 18 and he says this, for because he himself has suffered when tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. I don't know maybe what it is for you, and I don't know maybe the ways in which you experience this, but all of us, if we've had any kind of understanding, any kind of connection with God in our life, one of the things that we know is, hey, Jesus met me there. Right? Like the story where we fell in the hole, all of us, that's every single one of us has fallen in a pit. Now, whether we've been pulled out of that pit or not is dependent on what our stance is with God. Have we accepted the sacrifice of Jesus? Have we accepted the atoning work that Jesus exemplified for us on the cross? And we've said, hey, I don't only hear it, but I'm gonna accept it and then I'm gonna follow you and I'm gonna invite you into my mess and say, Jesus, help me get out of it. Right? The thing about falling in holes is this. The hole's deep enough, you can't get out of it by yourself. And so sometimes what happens is that we might have people that walk alongside us and they say, hey, I'll get in there with you. But even that person isn't strong enough to pull us out of the hole, right? Us being empathetic to friends of ours that are not walking with Jesus means that, hey, on our own, we can't pull them out of that hole. But what happens is that when the work of Christ is really like rolling in someone's life, then what Jesus comes and he comes in and he steps into our life and he steps down into that hole with us. He says, hey, I'm strong enough to get you out of there. but you got to say that you need help. You got to say that you're willing. And all of us have had a moment where if we've accepted Jesus, we've been down in that hole, God has jumped in there with us, and we've said, God, all right, at this point, I'll give it to you. I'll give you my life. I'll give it to you in that point because we've been pulled out. So we got to understand this, is that all of us have been there. And I don't know what your moment is, but as we reflect on those moments, one of the things that we realize is that because he suffered, he's now able to help. And here's the beauty, is in response to all this is what we can look at today and say, hey, God, because of what you've done in my life, there's got to be a charge that's given to me. And so as I look at maybe the end of today, I'm reminded of this quote. There's a scholar, he's a theologian, he's a Scottish guy. His name's William Barclay. And here's what William Barclay says, and I think this is great. Here's what he says. He came as a man, speaking of Jesus. He came seeing things with men's eyes, feeling things with men's feelings, thinking things with men's minds. God knows what life is like because God came right inside of life. And so this is the challenge for us, is that one, we would continually walk out of here saying, that's the God that I want to follow, right? That's the God that I'm going to roll with because I know that he feels what I feel. He knows what I've thought. He knows my very thoughts now, and he's been there. He's experienced them as a man. He's seen and felt things that I have felt. He has understood things that I understand, and he is walking with me, and he's leading me. And so that's part of it. But the other part of it is this, is that we say, hey, what if one of the responses in response to this understanding of the compassion of Christ says, hey, I'll now go into a hurting world, and I will be a representative of this kind of compassion. That I won't just be a guy that looks and sees people in my life that are struggling and they're down in a pit and they're in a hole that they can't get out of. And instead of walking by and being like, hey, you okay down there? You need a snack, you need some lunch, are we good? But instead of being that guy, that we be the guy that says, hey, I know I'm busy right now, but this is more important, man. I'll jump down there with you. I'll sit down there with you for as long as it takes. If it's a week, if it's 2 weeks, I'm in the hole with you, whatever it looks like, I'm there. And I'm there as long as it takes for you to get pulled out, for you to surrender, right? Listen, there are some stubborn men that live in this room, for one, I know that, right? But there are some stubborn men like all around our city that are unwilling to allow God to pull them out of a hole. And I just imagine that, like, if one of the things for us today is, hey, what if God wants to use you as an instrument to jump down into a hole with maybe another man or another person in our city and say, hey, I'm just going to be down here with you until God is to a point where he's ready to soften your heart. Man, I'll meet with you. Man, I'll sit and talk with you. I'll answer questions you've got. I won't be pushy. I'm just there in the hole with you, whatever it looks like. Listen, Jesus jumped in that hole for you. Jumped in the hole for me. He jumped in there and said, hey, listen, I'm gonna dig you out of this thing. I'm gonna sit down here with you, but I'm gonna rip you up out of there. I'm gonna set you back on your feet up out of that hole. And because of that, it challenges us and it pushes us to then be that to the world and the people around us. Here's 3 last things just really quickly to close. One is this: Jesus has been there, right? Anything you're walking through in your life, he's been there, right? He's been there. He's experienced it. He understands it. He knows, right? He's been there. He's walked through everything. He created it all, right? Nothing is beyond the understanding and the knowledge that God has. Which is the second thing, is that, listen, he understands. Not only has he walked through it, but he understands what you're experiencing now. And the third thing is he jumps in the hole with you every time. Every time he jumps in the hole. And so as I think about like this attribute, this compassion that Jesus has for me, I'm thankful and I'm floored and I'm humbled that this is the God that we get to serve. A God who says, hey, I'm with you, I'm walking with you, I'll walk with you through it, been there, I will be there. And so I think for us is that's the first part of today, is that we're just reminded who Jesus is. Right? He went to the cross on our behalf. He jumped in the hole with us. He takes care of us. He knows you, sees you, he's with you, and he understands you. But in response to that, I think that there's a bigger challenge maybe for a lot of us in the room today, and that is that we then be representative of this kind of compassion. And so what I want to do is I'm going to give us just a brief minute kind of as we close and just bow in prayer. And what I want you to do is I want you to think of one person in your life, one man in your life that comes to your mind right now that you say, you know what? Man, I'm frustrated. Maybe it's like I'm frustrated with them because they have dug themselves in that hole and I am not coming close to getting in there with them. They put themselves in there and I'm going to leave them down there until they figure it out. And maybe God needs to this morning, one of the things maybe God's doing is saying, hey, listen, maybe we should soften our heart a little bit and be reminded that you were very much that way. You dug yourself in that hole. You put yourself down there and you know what I did? I sent my son Jesus to step in that hole with you and get you out. And maybe one of the things that God is doing for us is he's saying, hey, let's soften our heart. Let's be reminded of what Jesus has done for us. And then, as frustrating as it may be, let's jump down there in that hole and let's sit with our brothers who are in need. So maybe it's that. Maybe it's just a person that's just walking through a really rough season. And they're good-hearted and maybe they love the Lord, but man, that's just like life is just throwing haymaker after haymaker after haymaker and they just can't seem to get their feet. And they just feel like life is just knocking them down there and they've fallen. And one of the things that maybe for guys like that in our life is that they just need somebody just to be there. They just need the physical presence of somebody just to say, hey, I don't know what it is. I don't know what I can do. Have no idea what words to say, but I just know that I'm here sitting right there with you. And maybe it's something different that maybe God brings to your mind. But what I want to do is I want to give us about a minute and just pray in silence. I want you to pray for that person, but more than anything, I want you to invite God into allowing maybe for him to give you an opportunity this week to just jump in the hole with that guy, to jump in the hole with that person and say, hey, as a brother, as a fellow man, maybe I've been there, maybe I haven't, but I'm with you to the end, just like Jesus was with me. So let me just give us a minute just in bow and silence, and then I'll close this in prayer here in a few. Father, I don't know. I don't know what it is, for I don't know what each person's thought of, or if there's a guy that's come to mind, or if there's somebody in their life that they're like, yeah, this is the person. But Father, I just pray you would make us men who are compassionate and empathetic in the way that you were, the way that you are. God, you don't. It's not like you just died on the cross and said, hey, I did it once, I'm done. Go off by yourself. No, that's not who you are, Father. You continually, even when we abandon you, when we turn our back to you, you continually show us compassion. You continually empathize with us by jumping in the hole and saying, hey, look, I'm with you. It's part of your grace. It's the love of Christ that we experience. And so, God, I just pray for those of us in this room that maybe we found ourselves in a hole today and we're just in need, that you would just come in there with us and remind us of how close and how near and dear you are to us, Father, that you're always with us. You always walk with us. You go before us and you understand it all. You feel things that we feel. You see things that we see. You understand things we understand. You know us and you know who we are. And so, God, for those of us maybe finding that place today that we're struggling, I just pray you'd go with us. But God, for the rest of us, maybe in this room where we feel like things are going pretty good, but we just know of people in our life that are hurting. People in our life who have dug themselves into a ditch that just feels like it's too big to get them out. I pray that you would remind us of what you've done, that you would place a compassionate and empathetic heart inside of us, that we would be willing to just be there for those guys, that we would be the representation of Jesus by being empathetic, by being compassionate, by climbing in the hole and saying, hey, I'm with you and I'll walk before you. The way that we saw today in Hebrews, God, that you put on flesh, that you became like us in order to redeem us and rescue us. And that's such a powerful thing for us to experience and to see today, is that you were willing to do that for us. So God, give us hearts in the same way. Lord, thanks for these men. Thanks for this day and for what will happen as we leave the walls of this building and carry on with our day-to-day business. I just pray that you would lead us to be better men, to be better followers of you, to be better husbands and fathers and sons and employees and owners and all the things that all the hats we wear, that we'd become better at that because we look more like you. So God, thanks again. We love you. We pray all these things in your name, Jesus. Amen. Thanks, guys. Make sure to wish the big man happy birthday on your way out. All right.
Thank y'all so much. Caleb, thank you much. That was great. Yeah. One of the things we're trying to do with the attributes of Jesus is take us as men and see how we're doing. Now, the truth of the matter is some of us do better at certain things than others. And as we compare ourselves to Jesus, a lot of us say, boy, I'm not even close. But what we're trying to do is take that attribute and say, what is Jesus saying to me about that? And how do I work on it? Because if 50 guys that come together here can make a change in each one of these areas, what an impact we can make on the city of Sumter. Mark did the first one on self-control, Ben on obedience, and now compassion and empathy. And each week is got a little different twist for us to look at. They're on the website. If you missed any of them, you want to go. I think Mark's is not. There was technical difficulty that week, but the others are up there. I'm reminded, Caleb, when you were talking about humility, that I've taken those spiritual gift tests and things like that, and I always come back and tell my wife that I scored 1 point on compassion, and she says I cheated. So we all have something that we really need to be working on and looking at. Next week, humbly before us will be Roby Kelly talking about humility. So we'll look forward to that. Who you got tomorrow? Billy Bennett will be here tomorrow morning. Great teacher. On Tuesday morning, here in the sanctuary, we have a men's Bible study. It's a verse by verse, and we're on chapter 16 in Luke, 15 in Luke. So just read the whole book tonight. You'll get it right. Thanks a bunch, guys. Appreciate it. See you later. Bye.